Hi. Before I was a college professor, and actually even before graduate school, one of my favorite things to do was to engage in somewhat wild speculation about, totally unknown or ambiguous causes. I'll just give you an example here to clarify my meaning. In the early years of college, I lived with 7 guys at one point in a 3-bedroom townhouse. We used to sit around in the living room, drinking. Usually one guy was playing Lara Croft Tomb Raider or something, and with total freedom, we would speculate about things. Things like, for example, is it possible that any woolly mammoths survive into the present? Was Antarctica ever inhabited by humans? Could alien life be based in elements other than carbon and water? Is it possible that the universe is uncreated and eternal in spite of what the physicists seem to observe? What was really the deal with those Aztec sacrifices? And so on. In a very informal way, we were practicing the dialectic, learning to learn from each other. Some of the best moments in all of this was when someone said something totally stupid, provably wrong. It was an opportunity to show him the error of his ways, And all of that is basically gone now, at least from my life. And it's sad. I mean, we're all kind of more afraid of speaking taboo words or saying something wrong or being mocked on social media, by someone with a more prestigious PhD than our own, or we're just socially distanced. Discourse is mediated through screens. We're all wearing masks. Spitballing. Man, spitballing isn't exactly illegal, but it's totally disincentivized now. Of course, I hope there are pockets of it in real life where teenage boys still sit together and engage in wild speculation, but it looks increasingly rare. Oh, before I get to Herodotus, which is what we're going to do in this, a couple of notes. First, the secret stream for patrons only was incredible last night. We talked about God and Protestantism and the rituals of institutional religion and so on, and it gave me an idea for the next one. So 2 weeks from now, for patrons only, we'll do the secret stream about the ancient megalithic builds from Göbekli Tepe to Stonehenge to Puma Punku. And what we're going to do for that one is go full ancient aliens meme. I mean, it's basically an attempt to resurrect that Wild West of totally free spitballing rhetoric that I'm trying to talk about here. If you say something crazy, awesome. We'll laugh with you and not at you. The starting text for this is obviously Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods and Plato's Timaeus, so you can, look at those if you like, but also bring any other sources or anything else you've heard. That's all fine. So that's something to look forward to for the patrons, and if you want to sign up, the link is in the description here. We'll do 2 secret streams a month as we have been doing, and those are just jolly. Next thing. Why don't I feel very bad about shilling this idea so hard today? Well, it's basically because I believe in it. The idea of true, freedom to speak. Wild speculation is a human right, and I think it's good for people. It's okay to be a Major League Baseball player who swings for the fences at every pitch. And, maybe at the end of the season, you're only hitting .235, but you've got 36 home runs. And that's okay. And I obviously also want to thank Keith Woods for doubling my followers. Keith Woods, fellow free speech advocate and book reviewer. Part of the perplexity, seriously, in my life, and I'm not kidding, this confounds me, is that I have a very clear memory of a college classroom, actually more than one, led by a feminist professor in 1998, an early adopter of the woke culture, saying to all of us English majors that it is a must for English majors to be and to remain against all censorship. Okay? Well, guess what, guys? I listened to that. I know some people on YouTube disagree with me on this stuff. I mean, some of those tradcath guys want a new inquisition and they want heresy laws and all of that stuff. But that ain't me, gang. As long as it's words, I'm okay with it. And so for that reason, I'm trying to get some of these videos shifted over to Odyssey so that these videos are hopefully safer for posterity. Okay, so anyway, yeah. That's my setup. Let's get to the Herodotus stuff. It is relevant, actually, to what I'm saying, and here's how it's relevant. Herodotus is a true chronicler of diversity in a time where diversity was a real thing, and like it was a florid thing. It had real range. When you read Herodotus, here's the book, by the way. It's huge. It's $11 from Oxford World Classics. When you read this, you are confronted with the seeming arbitrariness of so much of what we take for granted. In some sense, he would have been implicitly a postmodernist, if you know what I mean. Basically, like understanding immediately that there are no grand narratives because different peoples do different things differently, of course. And there appears to be, at least on many questions of culture and policy, no way to reason to the correct cultural form. What I mean is, for example, how should sex relations happen? Well, in our age, there are basically two answers, right? It's like with the rainbow flag hanging on the wall and with signed consent forms, however you want to arrange it. Or in the traditional Christian missionary style with no sexual contact happening outside of male-female marriage. But in Herodotus' time, there was, as I've hinted already, like a whole bell curve, a whole range of how people did this sort of thing. There were arranged marriages and consensual marriages and polygamy and virgin sacrifice, sex between tribes that couldn't speak each other's languages. Yes, sex where every man in the village had the right to lie with any woman in the village, and no such thing as marriage in some cases. I mean, listen to this section, for example, where Herodotus speaks of a tribe called the Nasamones, a populous tribe from around southeast Libya. He says, quote, "It is their custom for each man to have a number of wives, but as in the case of the Massagetae, any woman is available to any man for sex. A staff set up in front of a house indicates that sexual intercourse is taking place inside. When a Nasamonian man gets married, first it is the custom of the bride to have sex with all the guests, one after another, on her wedding night. Every man she has sex with gives her something he has brought with him from his house as a gift." So, I mean, that kind of thing. And Herodotus isn't even particularly impressed by examples like this. These occur on almost every page. He reports it all coolly. Because, I mean, on the next page, he'll tell you about the Scythians who, tamed the Amazon women by approaching them in the woods like one at a time until the women were impressed enough with their performance to come out and pair off as a whole group. Or whatever. And it's not just differences in, sex and marriage, but in clothing customs, in home building habits, use of special tools, customs of worship and sacrifice, and how they conduct diplomacy and subversion and war. The effect of all this material is dizzying, but it is also extremely liberating for the imagination. It provokes exactly the kind of impulse to true free speculation that I'm wanting to encourage lately. Oh, the Scythians were nomadic, scalped their victims, and melted down arrowheads to make sacrifices? Is it possible that they were the progenitors of what would become the Native Americans? I mean, look, you guys, probably not. But should YouTube ban me for suggesting something so far-fetched? I think definitely not, okay? Anyway, now Herodotus is altogether too much to try to summarize in a 45-minute video. I'm basically just trying to make a tempting trailer here for you. In fact, I'm only halfway into the whole thing, which consists of 9 huge books totaling about 700 pages. I'll do another episode on the second half. In general, the historic frame for the book is a record of the Persian Wars, where Greeks came together to fend off Darius and the Persian incursion. But in order to give his readers a deep sense of exactly how world-shattering the war was, Herodotus indulges in dozens and dozens of very interesting, long digressions about all manner of things. He talks a lot about geography as it was known at the time, about sociological stuff, about his own trip to Egypt, about mythology. And my favorite in all of this is just some of the early anecdotal stories he tells. And they're really like legends, actually, because we're in that zone of history where it's like the earliest recorded stuff, and it's not always clear whether what's being related is true or sort of like a rumor of truth. it's all really fun because, like, when Herodotus, for example, speculates about a race of one-eyed people living at the northernmost regions of Europe, you can feel that he sort of doubts it, but he's open to the possibility, since it's impossible to get reliable information from beyond the Danube or whatever. Let me give you an example of one of the stories he tells in detail. I hope you noticed my most excellent thumbnail, which features two different versions of the wife of King Candaules undressing. This is the first story told in the book, very, very ancient, probably partially mythologized, and it's suitably provocative to relate to potential readers, so enjoy. The story is told to explain how Croesus became the first man to subject the Greek peoples. We learn about a man named Candaules who was ruler of Sardis and a great something grandson, 500 years worth of greats, of Hercules. So the incident I'm about to relate begins with an awesome sentence. Herodotus writes, "Now this Candaules became enamored of his own wife and therefore thought she was the most beautiful woman in the world." Don't you love that sentence? He became enamored of his wife? Like, what the heck? Is that unusual? Maybe it was at the time. Like, I guess they might have had some kind of like, arranged marriage thing, and then rarely or occasionally or unusually, this king actually liked his wife. Anyway, now Candaules has a personal guardsman who was like a favorite of his, and my guess is they kind of grew up together because there seems to be a relationship. Now, Gyges, by the way, you'll remember if you're a Plato reader from, I think it's book 3 of the Republic or book 2, where Socrates talks about the invisibility ring that can make you go, the ring of Gyges, or I think it's Gyges, which could make a man invisible. Anyway, Candaules discussed everything with his servant Gyges, including giving increasingly lurid descriptions of his wife's figure. Quote, he says, "Gyges, I don't think you believe what I tell you about my wife's looks, and it's true that people trust their ears less than their eyes, so I want you to find a way to see her naked." This has got to be the absolute original self-own of all time, isn't it? Like the king cucking himself on purpose. It's amazing. Now Gyges, the loyal servant, tries to talk him out of it. "Master, what a perverse thing to say! How can you tell me to look at my mistress naked?" And so on. But Candaules insists. The plan is to wait for night to come and to hide Gyges behind the open door of the bedroom so that he can see her body when she undresses, and then sneak out as she turns to go to bed. But this brilliant plan, totally worthy of me and my best friend from 8th grade or something, goes sideways. The woman spotted Gyges on the way out. She realized what her husband had done to her. She knew she was humiliated. She did not cry out, and she did not let her husband know that she had seen Gyges. So as early as possible the next day, she summoned Gyges to her office. She gets right to the point and says, basically, "I know you saw me nude. That's improper. So now you have to either die or become my husband. I leave you no choice. Murder the king, and you can be the king and my husband now, or else kill yourself. Either he or you must die." And remember, these guys are probably BFFs, so it's a tough call. The short of it is that Gyges chooses to live, and so he kills the king. And that is how, at least as Herodotus tells it, the kingdom passed from the Heraclidae to the Croatians. Okay? Well, it's interesting. I mean, when you can read this, you can simply enjoy it as like a fun and bizarre anecdote. But especially in these early stories, it's also fun to think of them as like mythic, which is to say not false, but as indicating more complicated truths. Here's the interpretation, right? How did the monarchy pass from one family to another? Well, a lewd and carnal king cucked himself somehow. Is that a sort of parable? It really could be. Anyway, whatever. It's a great story, and like, how great are these paintings, right? These paintings were, of course, a very perfect excuse for some of the great painters in Europe to paint super hot women undressing. I mean, just Google Candaules painting and see the range. One more quick example, and here I'm leaving out a lot of details from a 10-page narrative. So basically it's about two guys, Harpagus and I'm not sure how to pronounce this one, Astyages. And it involves a king, so the king is Astyages, who becomes nervous that his own son will try to seize power. And so he basically leaves the baby out in the wilderness exposed or something like that. In fact, as I remember it, he has this servant, Harpagus, and he orders the servant to take the child out into the wilderness and kill it. I think that's it. But Harpagus, the servant, sort of chickens out and hands the kid off to a shepherd. Now the shepherd doesn't kill the kid, but actually raises him. Something like that. Anyway, eventually this kid, Cyrus the Great, is recognized as nobility. He has like a natural nobleness to his character. And now the king is really pissed about it because, his servant botched the whole operation. But he doesn't let his servant Harpagus know how mad he is. Instead, he invites Harpagus to bring his own son and this young newcomer, Cyrus, to a dinner. So the servant Harpagus tells his own son they're going to dinner and sends him to King Astyages with instructions to go there and do whatever he's told. Then Harpagus gave his wife the seemingly good news. We've been invited to a dinner at the king's house. Quoting now, okay? Quoting from Herodotus. However, when Harpagus' son arrived, Astyages murdered him and dismembered him. He baked some of his flesh, stewed the rest, prepared it all for the table, and kept it ready. The time for the meal arrived, and Harpagus and all the other guests presented themselves. The tables were laden. Astyages and the others were served mutton, but Harpagus was given his own son's flesh to eat, everything except the head, hands, and feet, which were lying covered up in a dish elsewhere. When he thought that Harpagus had eaten his fill, Astyages asked him if he had enjoyed the meal. Harpagus said that he had, very much so. Then the servants who had been given the job brought in the boy's head, hands, and feet, all still covered up, standing before Harpagus. They asked him to take the lid off the dish and to help himself to anything he wanted. Harpagus did as they suggested. He uncovered the dish and saw his son's remains. However, he did not allow the sight to disconcert him, but he retained his self-control. Astyages asked him if he recognized the creature whose flesh he had eaten. Harpagus replied that he did and that the king could do no wrong. Then he picked up what was left of his son's body and returned home. End quote. So for what it's worth, Harpagus does eventually take revenge on the revenger here, on Astyages, by betraying him to his own usurping son, Cyrus, years later. And you can see, here's one of the paintings of Harpagus bringing the infant Cyrus to the shepherd. I mean, well, I just love these interconnections, like the fact that this, probably 16th, 18th century painting calls back to this book written around 500 BC. I mean, reading this the other day and thinking about this stuff, as I was reading it, I tweeted something about how, this book, all of 6th grade education should just be kids reading through this whole book. That would be a huge improvement over whatever bullcrap they're being taught now. Herodotus, spend the whole year. That's all they should learn, right? Now, Herodotus forces the imagination to expand, and there are so many stories, many of them harrowing and titillating, like this one about Harpagus, that have been known by all educated people for more than 2,000 years, and now we are on the cusp of forgetting all of it because no one reads it anymore. Because we hide it behind a bunch of bullcrap that we make them read that has no connection to, the history of Christendom, or the West, as some people call it. There is a really interesting description of the city of Babylon, which suggests that the circumference of the city was 15 miles and that the entire thing was guarded by a wall 300 feet high and 75 feet thick. Supplement that with the idea from the book of Jonah that says it took 3 days to walk through the city, and you get a picture of a truly vast metropolis existing 3,000 years ago. Very amazing. Herodotus notes, and now I'm quoting, "The most disgraceful Babylonian custom is that at some point in her life, every woman of the land is required to sit in a sanctuary of Aphrodite and have sex with a strange man." Well, so, okay, maybe hold off until 8th grade if you're squeamish about sex stuff. Anyway, Herodotus' description of Egypt in Book 2 is extraordinary. It includes stuff about their gods, their pyramid building, their farming, a description of crocodiles, the ibis, and winged snakes. Pretty cool. He relates his own conversation with Egyptian priests who tell him that 341 generations have passed between the first king of Egypt and the final one, which according to Herodotus and the priest's calculation is 11,340 years since the beginning of Egypt. I regret that I waited until now in my life to read this book, and if you're all at all interested in history or the true variety of possibilities for human civilizations, Herodotus should get up near the top of your reading queue, for real. I will say this book has me reflecting a lot on the idea of logos. That is like, I mean, a lot of you have heard the things I've said about this already. I have a kind of, I don't know if it's unique, but it's a little bit of a, I mean, it's like I'm combining sort of E. Michael Jones with, my E.R. Dodds and Peter Kingsley stuff and theology and politics. And like basically the logos, as I understand it, is this idea where nature or creation or reality comes like as like a given, and you can't really negotiate with it. It's hard limits, right? And so you have to live in accordance with it. And so the question is, are there actual limitations imposed by nature that make certain social customs ultimately ineffective? Many of us assume that there are. But the impulse to take this idea and kind of run with it and turn it into a slippery slope where like everything that deviates from strict Christian orthodoxy is said to be like absolutely at odds with the logos and doomed, I think that seems like a stretch. When, for example, when people in the Massagete tribe got old, Herodotus tells us that all of their relatives gathered around them and stoned them to death because they thought it a disgrace to die of illness. And yes, that's murder, so I guess it's bad. But the question is, I guess, like, could the practice of such a divergent custom survive? Like, could its practitioners survive? Could other societies that do things drastically different than we do survive? Like, when I was a kid, I mean, by the time I was in 8th grade in like 1991 or something, I remember the sense that, and it's interesting because, you wouldn't expect this from these like supposedly anti-imperial people, but they gave you the impression that like civilization consisted of kind of like approaching hyper-technological society with high-speed rails and solar panels. And so like that's civilization and everything else is just not there yet, right? So everything is kind of going in that direction. But Herodotus leaves you with a totally different perspective on this, which is that like, no, it can go in lots of different ways. Lots of different ways. We could be doing things totally different than we do them. And, in other words, like humankind doesn't have to converge on the Dubai model of civilization, okay, or the Singapore model, or the New York City model of civilization, which is all basically the same, right? Anyway, Herodotus gets the old noggin jogging for sure. I don't feel like I've done total justice to this book, like not even by half. So I will welcome, comments and like a future episode. It will be forthcoming, to say the least. I might do more than one. I mean, it's really interesting, like just to almost flip open and like, yeah, like here's a fun one since I've got a couple of minutes left. These are the Scythians or the Scythians. He says, first of all, they scalp people. They scalp their enemies, right? So, and then he says, as for the actual skulls, the skulls of their enemies, that is, not all skulls. They saw off the bottom part of the skull at the level of the eyebrows and clean out the top bit. A poor Scythian then wraps a piece of untanned cowhide tightly around the outside of the skull and puts it to use like that. While a rich Scythian goes further. After wrapping it in a cowhide, he gilds the inside and then uses it as a cup. Also, if a Scythian falls out with one of his relatives, they fight to the death in the presence of their king, and the winner treats the loser's skull in the way I have just described. When he has important visitors, he produces all these skulls and tells how they had once been his relatives, how they made war on him, but he defeated them. This they call courage. And it's like, this is one way to live, you know what I mean? And the Scythians lasted for 1,000 years or more, and anyway, so, you know, whatever. It's a great read. I really do think it's like almost, it should be Herodotus and Thucydides as like and the Bible as your foundation, and Josephus as your foundation for sort of learning the classics. Yeah, like as I said, at least I hope I've piqued your interest. This is an $11 book. I mean, actually buy the hardcover and give it to your grandchildren. It's worth having. Thanks for listening. I've got a ton of ideas coming down the pike lately. I'm kind of fired up. I want to do an episode on Emil Choron soon. Probably on the Heights of Despair. I've been thinking about his thoughts about lyricism and depression and those sorts of things lately. I want to do one on Lu Xun's short story, Diary of a Madman. But I don't really have the next episode planned. I mean, you guys, I got at least 100 episodes left in me before I run out of material. So thanks for listening again. If you want to sign up and gain access to the secret streams, which are archived, they're all really good. I think they're like my best work because on those secret streams, I generally just like, well, I take it down by 50%. I'm not just lecturing. I'm having a conversation with equally quality or greater quality humans than myself. It's fun to listen to. You can participate for just $5 a month if you want to come on the stream. Every other Friday we do that. That's less of me lecturing and more conversational. And I still haven't found a post-academia job yet, so you guys who are patrons are helping me feel positive about life until we get our Biden money. See you next time on the Godward Podcast. Thanks for listening.